One of the primary concerns of lithium-ion battery, the lithium-ion battery problem, is the release of the toxic gases. The gases released vary in type, concentration, and it even depends on how much the battery is charged. The gases released and the extreme temperatures at which the release occurs pose a very serious health risk. Captain Tim Vamosi of the Easton Fire Department is a nurse practitioner and a paramedic. He's also a member of the Massachusetts Hazardous Materials Response Team. To provide us with information on the toxicology of the lithium-ion batteries, please welcome Captain Tim Vamosi.
Yep, right click. And to get it on screen. Got it. Thank you. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out and thanks for being here. When Deputy Galligan approached me and asked me to do a lecture on toxicology and chemistry, I said absolutely, but make sure it's after lunch. You heat the room up and dim the lights, so that way I can get everybody's attention. So we're going to talk a little bit about toxicology and the problem. So we kind of know what the problem is now, right? We know we've seen all the cool videos of stuff's exploding, and we've seen what the issue is when these things go into that thermal runaway. What I want you to take out of that is that there's two issues there, right? There's a toxic gas that's coming out, and then there's a flammable hazard that's occurring, and that heat and energy that comes off that can cause damage as well. The electrolytes inside the lithium-ion batteries is flammable, and you can see I'm going to put a lot of Thanksgiving words you can use to impress your date or your family when it comes to Thanksgiving dinner. But hexafluorophosphates, all right? That's kind of the one that I want you to look at. Lithium salts, there's a lot of different secrets to the sauce for every different battery and every different manufacturer. But the word I want you to pay attention to is fluorine, all right, fluoro. There's a lot of chemicals, as Travis showed us, that come off these batteries when they go into that thermal runaway and that toxic gas that comes off. But the one that I'm going to focus on today, and primarily because it's the one we have the most information on, is some of those fluorinated substances. So we saw the videos, and we know that these gases, we saw Travis show somewhere those gases, they ignite immediately and they burn right up, and those meters went off right away. And then we saw a few batteries that didn't quite go into that ignition, but they did put off the gas. We're going to talk a little bit about exposure and contamination, right? So just because we didn't have the flammable hazard where these things burned off, that doesn't mean there's not a chance there or an opportunity for us to become exposed to these. And there's different routes that we can be exposed to these chemicals. And when we think about exposure and contamination, just as a reminder, contamination is something we can take off, right? It's something that's on us, and I can usually clean it off and get rid of it, where exposure, that gets inside of us, and it's not so easy to clean off. It can cause a lot of problems once it's in there, because once it's in there, it's in there. And then in the case where we have the thermal runoff occur and the ignition happens, the fire occurs, that's where you get thermal burns, exposure burns. And we'll talk a bit about that as we get further on. But I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on that because we spent a lot of time in the fire service training on how to treat burns. And there's chemicals. So because I'm 15 to 20 minutes, I'm not going to go on the big list of chemicals. There's CO, there's CO2. We have asphyxiant gases, anoxic gases, irritant gases, stuff that's going to cause harm to our person, the public, and our first responders in many different ways. But keep in mind that there's a lot of different pathways that are going to happen here. So when we talk about the medicine behind this, the toxicology behind the way that these chemicals can affect, one rule serves all. There's just a lot. So we can talk about a CO, which again, we're all pretty well trained in the fire service on CO because it's so common, but it's going to get inside of our body and it's going to mimic something so that our cells can't soak up that oxygen like they normally do as an asphyxiant. Who's going to get rid of that oxygen in the room? So it's not really going to cause a chemical problem in the body too much, but it's going to get rid of the thing that I like the most, which is oxygen. And I don't know about you guys, but America might have a favorite pastime of baseball, but breathing's my favorite pastime, so I'm going to do everything I can to keep it going. So at elevated temperatures, fluorine content in the electrolytes is going to go through changes. And there's, as we saw earlier through our all the pictures that we saw of the batteries, there's a lot of components, a lot of parts, a lot of pieces. And we talk about vehicles and all the different electronic devices. There's a lot of parts to these things. And once they start to burn, they're all going to put out different types of gases. Polyvinyl lidine fluoride, again, we can go through all these, phosphorus, pentafluoride. But again, these all have that be really, really harmful to us biologically. So it's not just taking a look at one part of it. It's not just the electrolyte. It's not just the plastics. It's the anodes, the cathodes, all these things that burn or put out different things. I wish I had a solution for this and one typical answer that I can give you that would cover all of it. But the reality is, as these materials change and grow and as technology continues, gases come out. So keep that in the back of your mind too. The research that I'm presenting, but it's the research and the information we have now. But that's going to be changing again and again and again. But the one thing that we're seeing right now across the board in these commercial batteries is the source of fluorine. This is just kind of showing what happens in the presence of water and humidity. And again, if you take a look at the chemical reactions, you really don't have to know what all of to know that it ends up at 2HF, right? Hydrogen fluoride. And once we combine that with water, we get hydrofluoric acid. Phosphorofluoride is another one that we're starting. Not necessarily in all of the commercial batteries, but we're starting to see in some of them. The problem that we have, though, is there's not a lot of industry research done on this particular chemical. So I'd love to give you that shows what all of these things are. Hydrogen fluoride, and it's not necessarily because it's one of the most dangerous ones, but it's just as dangerous as phosphofluoride. We don't have a lot of information on phosphofluoride. So this is one of the issues we're running into when we talk about lithium-ion battery fires, is that some of this stuff just happens for us to present. But hydrogen fluoride, we'd have a lot of stuff on. So part of the problem is, well, what I'm going to show you is just some data to show you that hydrogen fluoride actually is a problem. The presentation by Travis showed that we were getting hydrogen fluoride on some of these sensors. So we started, a lot of places are putting this focus on hydrogen fluoride. And they're starting to also incorporate how we fight fires. So they're adding water to the mix. And I'm going to show you a graph next that says that even though we're trying to control the thermal runaway and the heat and the energy coming off of these batteries with water, it doesn't necessarily have an impact on the chemical aspect of what's happening. So even though we're putting water on these fires, we're putting water mists on them, trying to contain the gases from going places, we can push that gas somewhere, we can cool them down, but it's not going to change the amount of gas that's coming out of these batteries. So that hydrogen fluoride gas, as Deputy Galligan mentioned very briefly, is still going to come out of these batteries. And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution here, or a one-size-fits-all production of these gases. Depending on the size of the battery, depending on how many batteries there are, depending on the charge of the battery, the state of charge, the temperature in the room, all of these things are going to change how much gas comes in. So there's no way that I can say, if you have this battery, you're going to get this much hydrogen fluoride gas, and this is how we can protect ourselves. It's going to be different every time. But one of the things that they did see during the testing is when they actually applied water to these batteries when they were going through their off-gassing stage, that the mist actually increased the amount of hydrogen fluoride being released at that time, right? But it didn't disparage the hydrogen fluoride from being produced at all. The amounts were the same. The amount of hydrogen fluoride coming out was the same, just how fast it was coming out through there. So if we take the data from that really cool chart a second ago, we can see that there's a lot of hydrogen fluoride. The immediately dangerous to life and health level for hydrogen fluoride is measured in 0.025 grams per meter cubed. So that's not a lot, right? So 30 parts per million, we've all kind of familiar with how parts per million work and all this good stuff, so I won't harp on that. But just know that's a very small amount of this stuff can be very hazardous to us. Take that out, we can see that up top they're talking about kilograms of hydrogen fluoride coming off of full car battery setups. So again, if that's not an oh Jesus moment when you see those little batteries go off and put that gas out, we talk about 7,000 of those coming out, it's a really big problem. And that's a lot of gas that can be very dangerous. And those stages could occur in confined spaces, especially for us as first responders. We think about underground parking garages, all these kind of areas where there's large amounts of these batteries being stored, and then we send our guys in to go mitigate that. And now there's an area where this gas is being produced and held in that area, and it's very, very concentrated gas. So that time distance shielding that we talk about in hazmat radiation, because the dosing of how much they're going to receive of that hydrogen fluoride, how much our PPE can withstand, this is all still in the. but the risk increases, is what I'm trying to get at there. So hydrogen fluoride's the chemical. We talk about hydrofluoric acid. They're basically the same thing when we talk about them in commercial industry and how we're going to protect ourselves as first responders. It has a strong irritating odor. If you want to go up and sniff it after I told you how dangerous it is, that's on you. But I wouldn't recommend it, but it does have that irritating odor. The reason I put that in there is because if we have a fire going on and the public's coming out saying, hey, this smells really bad, we're starting to get reports that we're getting this weird odor and that kind of thing, strange odors in the building, just be aware that it could be something like this. It is considered a weak acid. Does that mean it's not going to harm you? No, it's just compared to other acids which might cause dermal burns very quickly. This one might not do it as fast. But it has not unique, but a different way of entering the body because of its chemistry. It's readily absorbed into our body. It can kind of wreak havoc once it gets in there. There's three ways it can kind of be absorbed into us systemically, meaning it goes throughout our body. So one way is an ingestion, inhalation, and mucous membranes, skin and eye contact, all right? I'm not going to focus too heavily on ingestion. If you guys are going to fires and you see your firefighters licking the Tesla after it burns, I think that's a whole different lecture we got to get into. But ingestion is probably not going to be the most common that you see out there. There is one way that we'll see common ingestion, which I'll talk about at the end, and that's in our pediatric population. But inhalation is probably the most important because it's the easiest and most readily absorbed into our body. And then those mucous membranes, right? We're spraying water, we're touching things, we're moving stuff. If we get that into our eyes or other soft tissue areas, it's going to be readily absorbed. These are things that we can easily mitigate, though. Respiratory, eye protection. If we have our SCBAs on in place, we're usually doing pretty good. But again, inhalation is extremely important. So the way that hydrogen fluoride works in the body, once it gets in contact with us or it gets inside of us, there's really two primary ways that it's going to cause us damage, all right? And this is kind of the chemistry of how it causes it. Hydrogen ions doing stuff, high concentration acid. Again, I don't know the concentration of hydrogen fluoride when it sprays off of there. It could be very high concentration when it's first off-gassing. It could be high concentration if it's in an enclosed space because there's a lot of gas and then we put water on it. So that concentration is 50%, 40%, 20%. These are things still being studied, so we don't have that. But know that if it's a high concentration in water and you get it on your skin, it's going to be a big problem. Even in low concentrations, though, it can be a problem, which I'll show you next. But when we're talking about high concentration acid burns, that's that gray burn that you get on the skin. Ulcerations, necrosis, that's the black, gross-looking fingers and toes, followed by intense pain. Not intense pain right away, followed by intense pain. Starts to insidiously work through the tissue, that's when it hits and we start to feel it. All right, so the second problem with hydrogen fluoride, the more, in my opinion, the more tragic part of it is it can be a problem in low concentrations. So even if it's a small amount in a low concentration, it can still do a lot of damage. And the reason is these fluoride ions, they're very small and they like to travel through tissue, okay? So once our skin is a great way, and it's a great barrier for us to protect us against everything that's going on in the world. But particular chemicals, hydrogen fluoride, fluorinated ones, they don't have a problem getting through our skin. As a matter of fact, they're readily absorbed through it. They're very small particles, work their way through, and they're attracted to things like fluid, which we're primarily made out of. They also like to be attracted to calcium, which is another big part of our body, and they like to join with that calcium and cause us a lot of problems. The other issue is it's lipid bound. So lipid being the fat in our body, it'll actually concentrate itself up. So some of these chemicals, when we get exposed to them, our body will process them right out through our kidneys, livers, and we can excrete them out. These ones like to hang around. They like to get into our fat stores and stay there. But that means the concentration of them can increase exponentially as we're exposed to it for longer periods. So once it gets in there and it starts reacting with cellular calcium and magnesium, it forms these chelates and makes these fancy little things on the bottom. But it provokes local calcium depletion, all right? So that's important to remember. And it inhibits sodium, potassium, ATP, like all these fancy words. But basically what it does, it stops the cell from functioning normally, okay? Because it's trying to find calcium and it's pulling calcium out of the body, which then allows things like potassium to increase in the body. And if there's any medics, EMTs in the room, anybody involved in healthcare, we know that hyperkalemia, too much potassium in our body, can wreak havoc and but it can also be detrimental to our cardiovascular system. It works off of that potassium and cause heart attacks and even cardiac arrest. And which is what I was talking about there on our first point. I've already got the lipid affinity, so it's going to hang out in the body. And because of these free ions are kind of going all over the place and wreaking havoc, it's going to cause necrosis. Tissues that aren't working correctly, they're going to start to. So again, this is happens out there. We don't typically run into hydrogen fluoride before lithium-ion batteries. It wasn't something we typically saw. So it was low frequency, high risk. Something that in the hazmat world, as firefighters, we always paid attention to with F-paper. And we went down range. We always had stuff out there to protect ourselves because it was so dangerous. We're now starting to encounter this in our regular firefighting stuff. So is it a fire? Is it a hazmat? Well, the answer is kind of yes, no. Those lines are being dangerous ones. Even in low concentrations, it's going to cause. And if you start to see stuff like this, which is the eyes becoming opacified in the corneas, this is scarring over the eye. You can see that they're irritated very easily. But we all know what happens when we get acid burns to the eyes. We know it causes damage. It's irreversible damage most of the time. It's very hard to treat eyes because there's only so many things we can treat them with. But the big part, it's underlined, delayed for several days after exposure. All right. One of the problems with this material, hydrofluoric acid and hydrogen fluoride, is once it's on your skin, it's not immediate. Right. It can be if it's in a high concentration, it's going to hurt, and we're going to say out. Right. Low concentrations of this stuff, if we're exposed to it over time, will accumulate in the body and start to burn slowly. So this could be hours, 24 hours, hours after exposure to hydrofluoric acid, these burns occurring. So it's really important that during the pre-fire stage, when that we have all our gear in place properly, that we're checking each other to make sure it's there. We're fighting that fire, we keep our PPE in place, and our post-fire analysis, because these hydrofluoric acid and that's going to be attached to these incomplete mix of combustion when we're doing our post-fire cleanup, and all our gear and our decon is still out there and still dangerous and can get on us. And you might not even know you're exposed to it for 24 to 48 hours before you start showing that you're having an injury from it. Acid, again, our lungs are really good at doing things like exchanging gas, right? That's literally all they do all the time. It's my favorite thing that they do. So if I put a different gas in there, I'm going to take that gas, it's going to put it in our body, and it's going to really exchange it inside of there, right? So our lungs are doing their job. They're doing what they're supposed to do. The only problem is this time, you can see how it's red, right? This is supposed to be a nice light pink looking tissue. But it's very red, it's swollen, it's a problem, right? One of the things that happens inside the body is when we have an issue inside of our lungs or our soft tissue, it sends a lot of fluid there with cells to fight that reaction. So what's going to happen in the lungs, and it's kind of hard to see on this screen, but you can kind of see how on the right side of that second picture, how it's kind of whitish looking through the x-ray. That's fluid. So the body's trying to fight this off. One of the problems that will occur is somebody can be exposed to hydrofluoric acid doing firefighting if they didn't have their PPE on properly, and they go home, they feel fine, everything's good, and then they start drowning in the middle of the night, they have trouble breathing, and it's because their body is now starting to have enough of that concentration there to start flooding that area with fluid, and they end up getting very sick very quickly, and at that point, it's very hard for us to reverse. Once that swelling starts in that soft tissue in the airway, if there's not ALS interventions done extremely fast, it's very hard for us to get that airway. Because now I'm trying to put a tube down into a swollen area, and I'm just causing more trauma as I'm doing that to that tissue, scarring, that kind of thing. The second x-ray up there is somebody who's exposed to hydrofluoric acid, same person all the way across, except you can see those opacities are almost gone, but still there. That's because hydrofluoric acid is actually scarring, damaging that tissue to the point where it died. And just like when you get a scar on your arm, it looks different than the other tissue. The same thing happens in the lung tissue, where it's a different type of tissue that's not going to exchange gases properly, and we have difficulties for long periods of time. This is just a picture of a dermal hydrofluoric acid. Again, this is high concentration hydrofluoric acid. All right. So we're probably typically not going to see this with lithium-ion batteries. They're like right next to it when it goes off and you get burned that way. But I just want to put it up there so you guys see that it causes this kind of necrosis in dermal tissue and see the kind of problems that can occur from it. And again, I'm not going to get into rule of nines and all the stuff that how we treat burns. But But when we talk about chemical burns, the other thing I want to talk about here real quickly is our decon. Make sure we're deconning these people. And when we take them to the hospital, make sure we're communicating with the hospitals to what they're getting. This isn't a typical burn, right? It's not just the thermal burn that we need to talk about. It's the hydrofluoric acid part of it as well, because they're going to treat that burn differently. Our initial treatment as first responders is going to be primarily supportive. This is specialty care. This isn't stuff that we're going to carry in our med box with us to treat these people. But they're going to have to, when we get them to the hospital, it's important that we communicate what they were exposed to. So it's not your typical fire. We need to let them know that they may need special medications to treat it. Whole body toxicity, which can be fatal. That's, again, if we're working down range in this for a long period of time, especially during overhaul, and this stuff is still floating around in the air and we're not paying attention to it. We've learned our lessons through the fire service with CO. We've learned our lesson in the fire service with cyanide. It's time for us to take this one before it happens and be really cognizant of hydrofluoric acid and hydrogen fluoride in the air during that overhaul phase. And treatment is removal from the site, rapid decon. That's on scene. We want to make sure they're clean before they go to the hospital so we don't end up with more exposures there or contamination there, followed by rapid treatment. And the treatment there's a lot of different medications. Again, because of time, I'm not going to get into them because we really don't carry them in the first responder field. But knowing that you need to let the hospital know what they need there. And the other option you can do too, and it's something we started doing on the Hazmat team, is contact the Hazmat folks in the state, let us know, and we can send information in the hospital as well. So due to the severity of these toxins, we have to be careful what we're doing. Again, full PPE, SCBA. They're going to talk about tactics in a little bit. See that some tactics might be different than what we've done for car fires and just fires in general in the past. So I'm not going to go too far into tactics. But again, first responder decon, a hazmat or a fire, the answer is yes. Next, all these things, specialty care facilities, we kind of talked about it. And knowing the right facility to go to, right? So when we talk about where we transport our burn victims to, can we take them to, our local community hospital? Maybe, if they're prepared for this kind of thing. But where this is new research, new technology, new medications, new information, there's a good chance that not every hospital is ready to receive this patient. So doing that pre-planning on your EMS side, knowing what hospitals we're going to go to, is extremely important. This picture here is of the thermal burns. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on thermal burns, but this is 2 battery cells in somebody's pocket. And you can see we have first degree, second degree, third degree burns or deep tissue burns, necrosis of tissue already. He put his hand over top of the pocket when it started to react in that thermal runaway, and his hand was severely damaged. I don't know the outcome of this one, but you can see that 1 or 2 of these cells puts out enough energy to cause catastrophic damage to a person, and probably the people around them. The other problem with these is we put them right next to our face, right? So when you think about where these batteries are located, they're located in the rule of 9s and the places that are the most vulnerable, right? Vapes are near our airway. We put things in our pocket. It's near our groin, groin area, genitalia. These things that have high risk for a high damage over low exposure. So we got to be aware of that. And we need to be prepared to decon these people properly. It's not going to be a comfortable decon. It's going to be hurt. I don't know if anybody's dealt with burns. It's very uncomfortable. It's very painful. But we need to make sure we're aware of where these burns are and how to decon them. F paper and pH paper are great ways to check people when we're doing our decon. If you don't have F paper, it's very cheap, easy to use. pH paper, again, it's a weak acid, but it's a good way to check our decon method. So when we're deconning these people before you put them in an ambulance, we can use those methods to make sure we're doing it the right way. Again, this is just a thing on burns. Critical burns need to go to level 1 or level 2 trauma center. We're kind of well versed on this stuff, so I'm going to skip through this slide pretty fast. But again, knowing where they need to go, but also adding the caveat of this isn't a typical burn is extremely important. We have to get them to a place that can mitigate them with the proper medications like calcium gluconate and some other stuff that's out there. All right, so when I talked about ingestion, this wasn't, some more. Actually, we're seeing a 66.7% increase in the ingestions of these button batteries. We all have them. We're probably all wearing them right now. So they're around. They're easy to find and easy for kids to get a hold of and stick in their mouth. So this has a lot of different issues in it. We've talked about the toxicity, the chemicals that are in these things. There's a lot of bad stuff that can happen. But the biggest problem we have with this is it completes the circuit. So it's not only just the off-gassing that occurs, it's not also the thermal runaway that occurs, it's completing a circuit inside somebody, and that can cause burns inside. And where's it causing that burn? Well, so this is and in the past, when kids would swallow a penny, you'd say, yep, wait for it to come out and we're good. That's not how this works with a lithium battery. Once that circuit's completed, it starts burning that tissue right away. So you're a really big problem. They need to go to a pediatric hospital that can support endoscopy. So again, doing that pre-planning for all of these situations is a lot, but it's stuff that we have to do. One of the remedies that's out there, and I'll put it out here, again, it's still new research, so I'm putting it out there cautiously. We don't take batteries in kids and test this stuff either, so we have to take it with a grain of salt. But honey is one thing that they're using as a way to mitigate these kinds of injuries. It coats the battery, hopefully stops that circuit from being connected, and reduces the burn potential. So that's one thing to keep in the back of your mind. Again, that's not approved through EMS protocols and that kind of thing. That's a conversation to have when you get in control. But it has shown been some efficacy in that case. This is a real quick recap on hydrogen fluoride. Basically, to wrap this up in 20 minutes into one sentence, it's bad. You're welcome. There it is. All right. And then considerations as we go down the road. As we saw earlier, there's a lot of byproducts. We can't just consider hydrogen fluoride. The reason that, again, I'm just expressing that it's one of the many chemicals that are very dangerous. But when we see any of those fluorinated chemicals, know that they're extremely hazardous for us as first responders and the public, and that we have to consider a different set of tactics when we're fighting those fires. More research that's needed. The research that's here today, it's not stuff that I went out and tested on people. It's done by a lot of academic places, and I give them the credit for the research. But it's stuff that we need to continue researching, and we need to lobby to continue researching. Newburn's doing a great job. Travis is doing a great job. A lot of people are really taking it by the reins, but it's stuff that we all need to be involved in, and it's stuff that we all need to advocate for. So your voices are very important out there when they get into the academic culture, not just on the medical side, but going through these things and talking with our academics, talking with our doctors, talking with our research facilities, and saying we need more of this to protect ourselves. And especially when it comes on the bottom part about PPE, personal decon for us, what is our firefighting gear going to do for us? When we can button that stuff up tight, we know we're protected, we know we can decon ourselves that way, but where's the research to back that up so we can, our guys can have a lot of faith in the decisions we're making for them? And industrial decon's another part of this. Once we wrap that fire up, once we treat those people, how do we know that building's safe again for occupation? So industrial hygienists, a lot of these things that we don't typically put into our regular fires become a part of this type of fire. References are up there, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Industrial cleanup. What do you think of that?
Yeah.